So, yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists. Happy anniversary. 60 years. Now, our congregation predates that merger. UUCLB was a Unitarian congregation before it was Unitarian Universalist, and I think probably a majority of our congregations predate the merger, but there are some that have grown up since then and that are absolutely Unitarian Universalist congregations that had no life before the merger. And I believe our congregation, UUCLB, called its first settled minister. We had some part-time ministers before then, but called its first settled minister that same year in 1961, 60 years ago. And when these two traditions joined, what kept us together was a covenantal relationship. Now, if you attended Reverend Robin Kapoor's excellent lecture this morning on Hosea Ballou, you would have heard about the Winchester Confession, the Winchester Confession of Faith, and that was from the Universalists. That was not a covenant. That was a creed. That was a creedal statement. The Universalists were not first and foremost a covenantal faith. There was a confession of faith, the Winchester Confession. This was a very important document. The Unitarians were a covenantal faith. And at the merger, we probably weren't about to become creedal all of a sudden as a joint entity. So we have been a covenantal faith since our founding 60 years ago yesterday. We have been in covenantal relationship with one another. A covenantal relationship, congregations with one another and individuals with one another. And we here in this congregation, we've been examining that for a little while now. And so has the UUA. The Article 2 Study Commission has been examining our UUA covenant. We examine it at least every 15 years. And the Article 2 Study Commission, which is the UUA's commission that's been charged with the task of reviewing our UU covenant, says this about our UUA covenant. And I quote, "Covenant lies at the heart of our faith, a shared agreement on how we should be together. Our religion is made from an ongoing, interlocking, and organically growing," I'm going to say that again, organically growing series of promises we make with our communities, congregations, and the world. Our religion is made from an ongoing, interlocking, and organically growing series of promises we make with our communities, congregations, and the world. So the entire UUA has been examining our UUA covenant, and so have we. We began this journey back in January when we started looking at our 6 sources of faith, and then we moved into our 7 principles and the proposed 8th principle. And that's brought us to today. And today we're looking at our whole covenant and what that means for us. That doesn't mean that I'm going to go back over each individual part. What does the whole thing mean? Why have we been doing this? Why did we spend all this time examining all the bits of this living promise we make among our congregations? Why do we keep re-examining it, and why do we keep changing it? What is so important about covenant? Well, let's talk about that. As I mentioned, we're a covenantal rather than a creedal faith. The Winchester Confession of Faith is so important for our history. But we need not confess it today to be a Unitarian Universalist. we are bound by our covenant. And I'm going to remind you again, because this is so important, what the study commission, what the Article 2 study commission said. Our religion is made from an ongoing, interlocking, and organically growing series of promises we make with our communities, congregations, and the world. And remember, congregations are the gathered. So today we welcomed 2 new members into our midst, into our covenant. They didn't have to make any statements of faith to join. They didn't have to sign on to the Winchester Confession of Faith or any other profession of faith. They had to agree to abide by our covenant. They had to enter into a promise with us. Now, we're not the only covenantal faith out there. Judaism, for example, is another covenantal faith. You don't have to make any statement of belief to be a Jew, but you must agree to abide by the covenant. What's the covenant? The 613 commandments that are found in the scriptures. Now, our covenant doesn't include 613 commandments. And that covenant is a covenant that was handed down from God to the people Israel. And abiding by that covenant is the center of that faith. However, much like Judaism, our covenant is what binds us together. Our covenant is not handed down from God. Our covenant is made one with another in the presence of the holy, if you like. Now, we used the image of a lantern when we covered the principles. And we used that image because, as Jean Davis reminded me when we were planning these services a while ago now, that these principles, they guide us like a lantern or a beacon. These are our principles, not just for how we relate one congregation to another, but for our daily living. Covenants are relational. So some people describe covenants as a holy contract, but unlike a contract, contracts have a relationship in them as well. But if one party breaks the contract, the relationship is broken. In a covenant, if we step out of covenant with one another, if we break something, the relationship is not broken. We call each other back in. Covenants are relational, and they're strong. Our 6 sources of faith are like a well. We draw wisdom from there. Some of us, many of us even, might have a favorite source, one that we return to again and again. But they are all there. They are all there to remind us that we are not meant to ignore any of them. They are there to sustain us together. I think the most important part of our covenant is the very last paragraph, the one that usually doesn't get much airtime. Now, if you have a hymnal at home, it's in there because the covenant is in our hymnal. We talk about the 7 principles. The proposed 8th principle has been getting a lot of airtime, and we talk about the 6 sources of faith sometimes, but we don't talk about this paragraph very much. And I think it's so important. Grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. Let's take that apart for a minute. We are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. Now, we come as we are. We meet people where they are. But we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. So if we came to the church a certain way, let's say angry at something we left behind, and not open to anything new, and 20 years later, our main faith, the main thing that we talk about is still how angry we are at the thing we left behind, and we still haven't opened up. Have we been inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision? And if we haven't, is that on the one individual, or is that on the rest of us as well? Because we haven't helped that individual along. Because as free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. We promise to one another our mutual trust and support. Now, this is a covenant among congregations, one congregation and another. How are we supporting one another? And this is the crux, I think. Now, we took the principles all out of order, and some folks think they're in the wrong order to begin with, and who knows, it's all being reviewed right now, and perhaps it will change. But regardless of what order they're in, I wonder if you've noticed that what they all point to is community and relationship. Nothing in our principles or sources indicates that we are to do any of these things alone. Our mutual trust and support, right? Nothing says that we are to put our own needs above anyone else's, even the third and fourth principles. And these are the ones that I think define us as Unitarian Universalists. These speak to individual spiritual growth and journey, and speak to that growth they speak to that growth in community, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, and a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Now, I suppose that you could go off and be a desert hermit somewhere and search for truth and meaning. But it's in the middle of our covenant, which means that we have a responsibility to help each other toward that free and responsible search as well. And because we start out by saying that we affirm and promote, and we end up by saying that as well, essentially, it means that we have a responsibility to one another in all of this. So it means that not only are we individually free, but we may not impede anyone else. We may not impede anyone else. So my freedom ends where I begin to impede your freedom, right? It's one thing for me to say, oh, I believe differently from you. But it's another thing to say that what you believe is stupid or wrong. We don't do that to one another. Or to say, we can't use that, we don't use that hymn here because I don't like it. It's not what I personally believe. So we help each other along in that journey. So it's relational, right? Our whole covenant is designed for us to be in community with one another and to continue to do the work of building the beloved community together. Now, last week we talked about the eighth principle, and this is aligned with the work that the UUA is already doing as a whole, and work that many individual congregations, including our own, are already doing. And it fits right in with that sacred promise. It fits right in with our covenant with one another. Now, as it happens, the Commission on Appraisal, and some of you might know that I serve on the UUA's Commission on Appraisal, has been studying covenant for the last several years, and our book on covenant will be out at General Assembly in this June. We felt it was that important for the whole UUA to be reading about this, and we've been studying it. And what are some of the things that we think are important in there? Well, I'm not going to give you a sneak preview to the whole book, but I will tell you that things that are important in covenant are mutual accountability. I hold myself accountable, and we hold each other accountable. Now, there are aspirational covenants, and many congregations have aspirational covenants. And the UUA's covenant could be in pretty much an aspirational covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. Perhaps you know that one. Many congregations use that as their covenant, the James Beela Blake covenant. Many congregations have as their covenant a behavioral covenant. Our UUCLV covenant could be described more as a behavioral covenant. This is how we agree to behave with one another. So what do we say? That we communicate with respect, with kindness and respect, right? We welcome all who enter. Things about how we behave with one another. It's a behavioral covenant. And then it goes on, we have subheadings in our covenant, or sub paragraphs that give very specific things about how we might call one another back into covenant. And that's also a good covenant. But everything about it is relational. So I'm going to ask you some questions, because our covenant is a covenant that we make with one another. It is not a covenant that was handed down to us from the divine. It is a covenant that we make. And as I look toward what's happening in Palestine and Israel, particularly in Gaza today, I think to myself, what would the world be like if everyone could live in covenant with one another? So I'm going to ask you about our covenant, and perhaps the larger covenant as well. What do you love in about our UUA covenant, and perhaps our covenant also? What do you love in our covenant, in our UUA covenant? What do you love about it? What would you change in it? And how can you get involved? Well, I'll tell you how you can get involved. The Article 2 Study Commission is asking people for input. Pay attention to what's happening in the UUA. Go to General Assembly. It's online, it's easy to go. Participate, be involved that way, because this is the covenant we make with one another. It's not handed to us, we craft it. So what do you love and what would you change? And then I'm going to ask you the tough question. How do we hold ourselves mutually accountable? Now, that's not just a question for our congregation. I'm asking you, how in the UUA, how do we as congregations hold each other mutually accountable? It's important one-on-one too. It's important in our congregation, but it's important in the wider UUA. How do we hold ourselves mutually accountable? I told you a little about, or Reverend Robin Kapoor in the breakfast forum this morning talked a little bit about the Winchester Confession. The Unitarians, the founding document of the Unitarians, or really the proto-Unitarians, the churches that many of them would become Unitarians, was the Cambridge Platform of 1648. And that was a covenantal document among the gathered churches in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that document very clearly called those churches to hold one another accountable. And I wonder if we've lost any of that. How will we hold one another accountable? How will other congregations in the UUA hold us accountable? How will we be accountable to one another? Because if we're going to awaken our spirit and connect in kindness and help to heal the world, we have to be accountable. If we are going to do the work of the church, if we are going to be out there responding to all the things that we need to be responding to, we need to know that we are connected in covenant and that we are accountable. How? How do we do that? These are tough questions. I'm going to ask you to think about them. And I noticed that Nancy Weston has put something in the chat, and I think this is important. She says she likes this part of our covenant. We participate in our church community with generosity and good humor. I'm not going to share the rest of it. I just want to hold up that this isn't meant to be sour and solemn. It's important. But nowhere does it say we can't be filled with joy when we do this work. So I hope you take it seriously. And I hope you are filled with joy because we are doing the work of the church when we are doing this work. Let us be the covenanted church together. Namaste.